It's me, SN Jalali, and you're watching my vlog for my young adult historical fiction and Andalus adventure. Now, last time I talked a little bit about the Visigoth Kingdom, but what was it really like for the Iberian peasants who lived under their rule? Well, this is where my story really begins. I'm going to take you to a key location to learn a little bit more about it.
What's suppression? Do you judge on appearance, or dig deeper at what quality of life is to answer it? Don't worry if you haven't seen the previous vlogs. Having said that, maybe you should. No pressure, but look what you're missing out on. Anyhow, back to this vlog. So I'm here in Gibraltar, where my historical novel is set, but during the 8th century. Today, Gibraltar has its share of beaches split between those on the west side of the rock and those on the east side. The beaches on the eastern side are more sandy as opposed to the beaches on the western side, which are rockier and with their own peculiarity and beauty. Still, it helps when it comes to world building and seeing my characters and plots come alive.
Andalus Adventure is a young adult historical fiction. It's inspired by real-life historical events set in 711 CE. It follows the story of the birth of Muslim Spain. So it's the journey of Tariq ibn Ziyad and his men as they came to Iberia, as it was known then, to basically meet the Visigoth Kingdom that was headed by King Roderick. So it's a really interesting period in Islamic history. We had the Umayyads, the Visigoth Kingdom, the story of Count Julian and his daughter Florinda, and it was an amazing period to write. A lot of research went into it.
History only records the names of the events and main players at the time, but there were no doubt countless nameless unsung heroes and lives around them. All we know of them is that they existed, and a catalogue of their lived experiences of a world they existed in and that ruled over them. And it's their story that inspired my fictional characters.
Qasim is a young Berber. He's from the village of Tlemcen. It's the same village as Tariq ibn Ziyad. And his story is that he joins Tariq's men to come out to Iberia. Along the way, he meets Hisham, who's another character. He's a little bit more older than him, and he's from Syria. He basically takes Qasim under his wings, and the two of them, you follow much of the story through their eyes as well. Friendship is something really lovely to watch as it evolves in the story. It is one of mentorship and one of brotherhood. You see the whole story unfold from the eyes of what it was like for the Muslims, not only living in the period that they were living in their specific areas where they were from, but also then going on to see their journey as they travel together to come to Iberia and watching the story unfold. Ben and Bella are a brother and sister that live in the Visigoth Kingdom. Ben is a 16-year-old boy, and he's part of the whole feudal system where he and his family have to work the fields, work the land. And there's no other future for him beyond that. And it's something that obviously doesn't sit well with him. especially when being a young teenage boy, he wants so much more for himself, for his own life. And I think with him especially, when he hears stories about how life is like in a far off distant land where people aren't living the kind of life that and having the kind of life experiences that he's having, then he feels the pain of that more. And so that chapter basically just captures and sets the scene of what life was like in the Visigoth Kingdom for the communities that were living there, and how hard it was under the Visigoth kings. Bella's story is slightly different because, coming from a female perspective of what life is like, for her, the story is that she's at an age where she's facing pressures, where she should really be getting married. The only people that would be available to her as suitors weren't the type of people that she would ever consider. And for her, that was the biggest fear, that it would, in most likelihood, be a forced marriage. And that was something she just couldn't contemplate. And actually, for her, her day-to-day life is filled with this whole fear of what would happen if the Visigoths ever found out who they really were. They weren't living the lives that was expected of them, that they weren't, despite being baptized, they were still practicing their faith, the faith of their ancestors, in secrecy. So for her, it was this constant fear of living under that scrutiny, where any day, if they were discovered, they would seriously be facing slavery. I remember once reading this piece of literature that my daughter had showed me, and she started to immediately ask me questions about Muslim Spain. She had no idea that it even existed at one point. So basically it began from there, not being able to explain to her fully, because I myself didn't know much about that period myself. So I started researching, and then suddenly the ideas started to come to me, and the story and the whole adventure, if you like, it just gave me the idea of writing this fiction. But of course, it's, I say fiction, it is inspired by real life historical events. There was a period in history where, as the story goes, Count Julian, who was from the Visigoth Kingdom, he was living in Ceuta, he was the governor of Ceuta. His daughter had been sent to court in Toledo, which is the capital of the Visigoth Kingdom. And that was normal for that period for the aristocrats. They would send their daughters and their sons to learn about court life. And it was during her trip there that she was basically mistreated by the king, King Roderick. Julian, being very unhappy about the situation, then managed to get his daughter away from the kingdom, but he wanted revenge. So he went to see Musa ibn Nasser, who was at the time in Karawan. And he basically suggested to him, and he told him about how life in the Visigoth Kingdom in Iberia was very, very hard for the people, hard for even the elite that were there. And that's how the story began. And this is how then Musa ibn Nasser appointed Tariq ibn Ziyad, and him and his army came out to these shores and began this incredible period in history where you had 800 years of rule over this section of Europe. I think my most favorite scene to write was in chapter 12, The Landing. And it's the scene where Tariq ibn Ziyad and his men, they are coming off the boats. And for me, trying to recreate that scene and writing about it, it was so exciting. Just the image, the idea of them wading powerfully through the water on their horses, some of them coming off their boats. When I saw images of this beach, I could just imagine something like that happening I'm not saying this was the beach, but just the whole scene came alive for me. But for me, trying to recreate that spectacular image, having the rocks, the huge massive rock, looking out over at them, watching them coming out of the water, it was just one of those scenes that for me personally was one of the ones that I was really looking forward to write. You could imagine what was going on in the minds of the characters, like Qasim, when he first sees, it was one thing to see the rock from the boat, but actually when you're going through the waters heading towards the beach, to actually see this amazing scene, it must have been a moment, when it first hits you, what it must have been like coming to this unknown land. What were they going to be facing? What was going to happen? So it was quite an exciting scene to write, to try and imagine the expectations. This is one of the beaches. I think this was the one that inspired me the most for the first chapter about Ben and Bella. It's the opening chapter where we see Ben sitting at the top of a ledge, and that's where I kind of imagined him looking out and seeing across in the far distance North Africa, wondering about what life was like out there. Was the grass green on the other side, as he had heard? And then looking back at his own life and his own world on his side, thinking about the difficulties and the problems that his family was facing. Tariq ibn Ziyad is supposed to land on the beaches with his men. Ben looking out over the waters, watching them, wondering who they are. And then Qasim looking back up, wondering, was that someone out there watching them? For me, it was really important to begin this story with Ben and Bella from the perspective of the peasants, as opposed to Count Julian and Florinda, which is how most stories began. When the Muslims came to Iberia, the peasants genuinely viewed them as saviors, given how badly they'd been treated by the Visigoth Kingdom.
Gone were the harsh strictures of feudal society, to be replaced by a tolerant society where different faiths flourished. People who could own lands and had rights to protection and local autonomy, all favourable terms in their eyes in exchange for a tribute they paid that was nothing like the Visigoths' terms, which contrasted sharply. Not surprising, the main cities from the Visigoths realm did not put up any resistance, apart from those in the northern mountains who long before the Muslims' arrival were fighting for independence. Otherwise, most of the Visigoth realm accepted the favourable terms and the relative freedom offered to them under the Muslims. In time, both the Arabs and Berbers regularly intermarried within the local people, which would lead to a unique society that was infused by aspects of Arab, Berber, and Hispanic culture.
The word Andalus in Arabic has many meanings, and one of them means to become green at the end of the summer.
Glades of lush green grass comes to mind. A vision of healthy, fertile soil with so much scope for growth and opportunities. It was certainly the case for the people of Iberia in the summer of 711 CE when the Muslims arrived. Gone was the oppressive rule of the Visigoths. Instead, it was a new beginning, with the promise of peace and prosperity that saw the Muslims rule for more than almost 800 years or so. So where other stories began with Count Julian and Florinda, I chose to be different.
In the end, I decided to write the story from the perspective of the peasants of Iberia. By the way, you can read chapter 1 of my book where you meet Ben and Bella for the first time. Just head over to my YouTube banner.
Or you can find the link in the description below.
So here's a clue for my next vlog. The animal world features heavily in my book because it's set in the 8th century. From horses, Barbary macaque to dolphins, I'm going to be heading to the summit of the rock to see one of them, and I'll leave you to guess which one it is. Or you could subscribe, turn on your notifications, and watch the next video.